Chapter 6, Part 2. Now we're going to look at when we use our contribution margin, what happens when we have changes in production, and we'll look at target pricing and using the contribution margin ratio, which is a really excellent way of comparing two things that may have different totals, contribution margins, but when you figure out what the contribution margin ratio is, it may help you make a different decision than you normally would. And I have an example of that here. And this is like your homework again. So when we do traditional gross profit, we take sales minus cost of goods sold. And that gives us our gross margin. A lot of people look at that, and that again is external reporting. So now let's take a look at what's the gross profit based on absorption pricing if we make 16 and we sell 12 versus if we make and sell 12. So here we go. We know we have sales of 12,000. Cost of goods sold, we're going to come up with our direct costs, which are direct materials and direct labor, times the units sold. And then we're going to come up with our manufacturing overhead. Remember, you have to take the, in this case, we have to take the variable portion, which is $4, plus we have to determine, and based on units produced, we're going to come up with the fixed amount per unit. And that gives us a total of $18 times 12,000. And that less that gives us our gross profit of $228. Again, we're only looking at gross profit. Now, what if 12,000 units were manufactured and sold? Well, the difference would be our sales would be the same. Our cost of goods sold for direct materials would be the same. It would be that $28. But here's what would change. We would add in the fixed portion, all of it. So we would take our variable portion times the units produced plus, remember, use units produced on that, plus all of the overhead. And now we get a total cost of goods sold of $608, and we have gross profit of $172. Now, the difference between these two is that 56,000, when we produce, in this case, $4,000 units more than what we sold, that 56,000 in fixed costs remain behind in ending inventory. So you add that to the 172 and you get the 228, which is what it is if we only sold 12,000, made 16 and sold 12. Now, contribution margin statements. Organized by cost behavior. All variable costs are expensed above the contribution margin, and the contribution margin equals sales revenue minus variable expenses. And again, this is only for external purposes because you can't not count costs. The contribution margin statement is going to be sales minus variable costs, and that gives you the contribution margin. This tells you how much do I have left over to cover my fixed costs. And we also know that when the contribution margin equals a fixed cost, we are at break even. Remember that from one of your other chapters. So let's prepare a contribution margin statement at different sales levels. So here we have 12,000 units sold, even though we're making 16,000. We're going to indicate our variable cost of goods sold, which is the 20 plus the 8 plus the 4. But remember, we also include our variable operating expenses. So that's a big difference, and don't forget that. So we look at our variable operating expenses, and that gives us 12,000, and that gives us a contribution margin of $384. Now remember, the rule is whenever you're using variable costs, the unit cost doesn't change. The only thing that changes is total cost based on increase or decrease in production. So it's not it's not how much you make, it's how much you sell that's going to affect that contribution margin. Because let's see what happens when we made and sold 12,000. We get the same sales, we get the same variable costs because our sales numbers haven't changed. Doesn't matter how many we produced. And that gives us exactly the same contribution margin. So because of cost behavior, when using variable costing, the contribution margin does not change if units produced is greater than units sold. With variable costing, it only is going to change if the units sold changes. So what about setting target prices? There's a 3-step process. We first determine the product cost per unit under absorption costing. Remember, absorption costing. Determine the target markup, and then add the target markup, and that tells you how much you're going to sell it for. Now, first, we're going to determine our fixed overhead per unit because we're doing absorption costing. So we're going to take the fixed portion divided by the number of units produced, and then we're going to figure out our cost of goods sold, including that $14 in fixed overhead. So that tells us we have a unit cost under absorption costing of $46. And then we're going to take the $46 times 60% because that's what they want is the markup. And we're going to add that. And that is going to give us our target selling price. Now the next thing and this is a homework problem. Next thing, we're going to look at contribution margin ratio, which I think is probably one of the most important, and in this example, it'll show you why. It's going to be your contribution margin in dollars divided by your sales in dollars, and that's going to give you a percentage. That's what the contribution margin ratio is. All right, so here's an example. We sold the same number of 2 different kinds of bikes, 600. And this is the cost associated with each one of them. We have our sales price, our variable cost of goods sold, and our variable selling and administrative expenses. Again, remember, whenever you do contribution margin analysis, you have to include the variable selling and administrative expenses, only the variable ones. All right, so first, we're going to look at our sales. We're going to take our 600 units times our sales price. Then we're going to subtract out our variable costs, $840 for the road bike and $480 for the mountain bike. And then we're going to take out our variable selling and administrative costs for unit. For the road bike, it's $60. For the mountain bike, it's $64. So now we have our contribution margin. Now, if we looked at this, we'd say, wow, it is more important for us to sell more road bikes because we make more money selling the same number of units. Aha! We have to look at something different, and that is the contribution margin, which tells us for every dollar we generate, what percentage do we leave to cover our additional costs. The road box is 25%. So here's what we do. We're going to take our contribution margin divided by our sales, and it tells us for road bikes it's 25%. So that means for every dollar we sell, we keep 25 cents to cover the rest of our costs. But look what it is for mountain bikes. For mountain bikes, it's 32%, which means you're keeping more. You end up with more to cover your fixed costs when you sell mountain bikes than when you sell road bikes. So the better contribution margin is mountain bikes, and you probably should focus your advertising on selling more of those because you're going to keep more of the money. And that ends Chapter 6, Part 2.